Yeah, I want to thank Whitebark Institute for hosting this series, and Main Street Pizza and Tap for being the host for my presentation today. Very much appreciate it. And yeah, so why don't we jump right into it? Next slide, please. For my presentation today, I'm going to talk, first of all, to put us all on the same page. I don't know where everybody's coming from in terms of their knowledge about wildfires and wildlife in the Sierra Nevada. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about historical versus current conditions in Sierra Nevada forests, where we are now and how we got there, and then jump into the wildlife portion. Spend the bulk of my talk talking about several recent wildlife studies that really, in brief, summarize some of these effects we're seeing in wildfires on wildlife in the Sierra Nevada. One focused on birds, bats, and plants. Another one focused on Sierra Nevada fisher. And the third one focused on California spotted owl. Several studies on that species in particular. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so fire in the Sierra Nevada. Fire in Sierra Nevada forests, really the key point to take home when it comes to think about fire in the forests around here, and around Mammoth Lakes and throughout the Sierra Nevada, is that fire is considered a key ecological process. It does a variety of things. It promotes a bunch of key ecological processes like soil nutrient cycling. It promotes tree regeneration, especially in shade intolerant species like pines. It promotes a lot of plant diversity, as you see in a second. Supports low tree densities and fuels in many of these forest ecosystems, enhances ecosystem integrity as a whole and resilience, and creates a diversity of wildlife habitats, which support a variety of wildlife species. Next slide. Historically, what's really promoting this beneficial fire process is generated by what's in our particular mixed conifer yellow pines forest ecosystems by a fairly frequent fire regime. These fires historically burned about 7 to 15 years on average, what we call our historical fire return interval. And the ignitions were primarily derived either from lightning or local cultural burning from many of our tribes in the Sierra Nevada. When fires did burn, not only did they burn frequently, because they burned so frequently, a lot of the fuels were actually quite low, the tree densities were quite low, and we see most of those areas burned at what we consider low to moderate severity. That is, they didn't burn stand replacement severity. Most of the dominant overstory trees did survive, in many cases, and burned at low severity, some at somewhat moderate, but there were always trees that remained on site post-fire in this type of fire regime. Of course, every once in a while, you get canopy gaps that are created because you get localized torching, and some of these trees would die in small gaps, typically less than an acre in size, creating some of this sort of variable spatial pattern we see in Sierra Nevada forests, where you get really what we consider somewhat of a salt and pepper pattern of various severity classes across the landscape. So you might walk through a stand and find here, all of a sudden, there's a high severity patch, and the next, you find a completely different forest condition with different forest structures in it. And this variable spatial pattern repeated itself across the landscape throughout these forests. Next slide. However, the big problem in how we're getting here today is that we've experienced several things in the past, and one of the major of those factors that have happened in the past century and a half is fire exclusion and fire suppression. Within about 100, 150 years, we've seen, with the removal of fire's key ecological process, you can only imagine if they're burning once every 10 years, let's say, you miss 100 years of fire cycles, you've already missed 10 of them. And each time a fire doesn't pass through, what you get is a buildup of fuels and vegetation. And so what's happened is you get a substantial buildup in tree densities and fuels, tree densification, a loss of many of these key ecological processes that fire really initiates in these ecosystems. The habitats start to homogenize as trees infill, fuels infill, and basically you get a similar situation, as well as reduced ecosystem integrity and resilience. Next slide. Coupled with fire exclusion is we've had historical logging impacts. Throughout most of the Sierra Nevada in these forests, especially these mid to lower elevation forests, we've seen in the mid to late 19th century into the early 20th century, we saw widespread forest loss due to this logging. You can see some of these photos here. Actually, the one in the center on the left were actually taken here on the Inyo National Forest, not that far from Mammoth. The one on the right, I believe, maybe taken from the Sierra National Forest, I can't remember, but in each of these cases, logging companies came in before the creation of the National Forest System and basically just slicked off a large part of these fairly large diameter trees, especially pines. So today we see a loss of these large shade intolerant pines like Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, and ponderosa pine. And what came in afterwards was a rapid ingrowth of shade tolerant conifers like white fir and cedar. Next slide. It's easy also to forget beyond the logging impacts and fire exclusion, there's other things that happen historically like widespread grazing. Once again, before the advent of the National Forest System and most of our national parks, there was widespread sheep grazing, which really denuded a large part of the understory, especially we still see impacts of that today, whereas particularly in the eastern Sierra Nevada, we see reduced grass and forb cover. That happened especially during that period, and also it led to a reduction in the fire frequency in that late 19th, early 20th centuries, and contributes to the long-term alteration of our fire regime. So these three factors together, next slide, really led to our current problem today, which is, as I already mentioned before, we got forests that are too dense with shade-tolerant conifers. And when I say too dense, they can often be 2 to 7 times greater than they were historically. How do we know this? We know this from historical stand inventories, and particularly in the relatively small tree size classes is where we see the greatest increases in density. So trees that are smaller than about 16 to 24 inches in diameter. Most recently, we've seen also an increase in surface fuel loads with this change, but also recently with the 2012 to 2016 drought in California, we also got additional fuel loads associated with especially really heavy fuels. And so here's a study I was involved in that was published about 10 years ago. And this looked at some historical stand inventories between 1911 and about 100 years later, that's the current period. And take a look at that tree diameter class in the 30 to about 60 centimeter. This is around 12 to 24 inches in diameter. We saw nearly an 8 times increase just in that diameter class. In the diameter class just above it, we saw maybe about a doubling in trees that were about 24 to 36 inches. And most notably, the trees that are 91 centimeters and above, that's around 36 inches. These are the large trees. Those actually showed a substantial decrease between the historical versus the current inventories. And that's once again driven by that historical logging impact coupled with these other stressors such as fire exclusion. And that's what we're seeing today in manure stands, just far too many trees. By the way, historical stand inventories didn't really measure trees in the smallest size class, less than say 6 to 12 inches. And if we were to show this, almost undoubtedly, that would be just as great an increase as that one that's about 30 to 60. So next slide. So our current problem is not just as simple as we have too many trees and too many fuels. There's also other things that have happened in a forest. They've homogenized. And what does that mean? Well, what historically these forest stands look like is that photo on the left. See, that photo on the left shows a combination of canopy openings, individual trees, and small clusters of trees together. That's historically what we had. What we have today is that photo on the right, which is all these openings have filled in. All the individual trees were now surrounded by other smaller trees, and everything's large clusters of trees. And they're all dense and they're all packed in with one another. So we don't have that heterogeneity, is what we like to call forest structural heterogeneity. We've lost it. And why is that important? Well, I'll speak to that in a second. But one big, I'll give you a hint, is it's really important for wildlife, really important for providing variation in the wildlife habitat. And of course, we're lacking big trees for old forest-dependent species, that size class that's around mid-30s to about 40 inches or greater. But anyways, by the way, well, let's just get that. Next slide. So the consequence of all this long-term fire exclusion, logging, grazing, and such is not just all these different factors I'm talking about of consequences of tree densification, fuels, homogenization, so on, but we've also lost a large portion of our old growth or old forest Sierra Nevada habitat. And the ones that do exist are still at risk to large and severe wildfires that are becoming more frequent in our forests, drought, insect outbreaks, and climate warming. So all this leads to decreased forest resilience. And you can see that in the slides there. You know, the top is kind of what we had historically, top panoramic photo, and you get to the bottom, that's after a stand replacing fire, and it basically burns at high severity, and many of these trees forests are lost, even in the long term, because they may not regenerate. Next slide. So this gets me to the essential question I'm going to try to address in my presentation, which is, are modern wildfires threatening habitat of Sierra Nevada wildlife species in the bioregion? Are they essentially, quote unquote, burning down the house for many of these species? The suite of wildlife species I'm going to address are a combination of our habitat, what we call our habitat generalists and specialists, those that occur in a variety of different habitats. We're specialized in a specific one. And there's no better example of a habitat specialist than our species that are dependent on old forests. Those are species like the fisher and the California spotted owl. There's some pictures of them up there. Let's go into our three studies, or several studies here. So let's first talk about birds, bats, and plants. Next slide. This study was led by Zach Steele. He's a research ecologist at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, the Forest Service. And he asked this basic question. He involved, there's a variety of us co-authors that were involved. His question was, how does bird, bat, and plant species richness vary across gradients of fire severity, frequency, and biodiversity? That's a simple question to ask. So next question, or next slide. And this study was done in Yosemite National Park and the Ansel Adams Wilderness of the Inyo and Sierra National Forests, both in areas of relatively active fire regimes. Those are areas where, particularly in Yosemite, fire has been reintroduced as a key natural process for the last 4 or 5 decades, and more recently in the Ansel Adams Wilderness. And also importantly, these areas were never logged historically or currently. Next slide. The approach was to sample birds, bats, and plants using plots, point counts, and acoustic surveys back, roughly that's between 2012 and 2022. Next slide. And here's basically what we found. In terms of burn severity, so this is burn severity, if you remember I described to you low, moderate, high. These are areas that burn. How much of the forest, dominant trees and overstory, dies post-fire. And we go from a burn severity metric that's CBI stands for Composite Burn Index. It goes everything from 0, which is unburned, 1, which is low severity burn, 2 is moderate, and 3 is high. And on the y-axis there is species richness of these different species groups and taxa. Birds seem to peak, their diversity seems to peak at about low to moderate, especially at moderate severity. Plants actually peak at lower ends of the low end of low severity. And bats are somewhat kind of they're doing their own pattern, which is they peak in unburned areas and areas that burn at moderate to high severity. So that's pretty interesting. They each know their own pattern. But next slide. If we look at burn frequency, how frequently the fires are burning in a particular stand or area, birds and plants do best or have the highest diversity in areas that burn the most frequently. And what I mean most frequently is less than every 10 years. Bats, in contrast, show an opposite pattern, which is they actually do better if they burn in areas that burn fairly infrequently, every 30 years or more. And in fact, some of these relationships you'll see, they're not linear. Since they change over that frequency and severity gradient like birds. Next slide. And the last is biodiversity. And biodiversity, the best way to describe it is it's a composite of burn severity, frequency, and patch size and patchiness within those burn parameters. And basically what we found was that birds, plants, and bats all show this, even though it starts off differently. As you get to higher levels of biodiversity, all show higher levels of biodiversity. So that's really interesting that they show, at least in that particular metric, all the same pattern. And if we look in the study at biodiversity hotspots, where does most of the birds, plants, and bats occurring? Well, for severity, what we found was they were occurring in areas particularly of low to moderate severity, if you include all 3 taxa, especially areas that burn at moderate severity. They also occur in areas that burn most frequently, and next slide, and in areas of moderate biodiversity, but which really is characteristic of the overall landscape. Next slide. And so kind of summarize what we found. Birds and plants, they really peak at the first decade following fire. That's a really strong pattern that we found, and was highest at low to moderate severity burned areas, not in areas that hadn't burned in a long time or areas that burned at high severity. Bats, in contrast, they showed increased species richness for longer fire turn intervals, divergent fire severity patterns, where, like I said earlier, it's more kind of this mix of unburned, moderate, high. But if we looked at kind of the overall patterns of those biodiversity hotspots and so on, it seems like the forest management implications are fairly clear, that restoring natural fire regimes and biodiversity should really benefit these wildlife species in the Sierra Nevada, with the caveat that total species richness would be highest under more frequent and varied fire regimes, especially more frequent fire and maybe more on that moderate end of the severity spectrum. This is a bit different than what fires burned historically in these ecosystems. They tended to burn a little less frequently and a little less severely, but one thing to keep in mind here is that this is a reintroduced fire regime. This is where we're putting fire in, especially in the Ansel Adams Wilderness, but also in Yosemite. Fire is being reintroduced after many decades of experiencing fire exclusion, and it's gone. So in a historical fire regime, it's always burning. It never stopped for millennia. Now we're introducing fire. It seems like it makes a lot of sense in a way, is that you actually have to burn a little bit more frequently and a little bit more severely to get it back on track in the beginning. And that's what these biodiversity metrics are likely tracking, is just showing a lot of the benefits of fire early on when you reintroduce it. Next slide. Interestingly, other previous studies suggest biodiversity habitat heterogeneity can be achieved very similarly with forest restoration treatments that includes mechanical thinning combined with prescribed fire, and treatments seem to be the most effective when fire is part of that equation. Fire has to be part of that. That's where you see the real benefits of biodiversity. So yes, mechanical tools can really help, but fire has to be a piece of that. Next slide. All right, enough about birds, plants, and bats. We're gonna move on to Southern Sierra fisher. So a little background about the Southern Sierra fisher. It's a mesocarnivore species in the weasel family. It is also a federally endangered species. It's the Southern Sierra fisher is a distinct population segment that occurs, fisher does occur in many parts of forest areas of Western North America, but in the Southern Sierra, there's only a population of a few hundred individuals that occur in the Southern Sierra, mostly on the west side. Every once in a while, they kind of poke their head over here on the east side, but most of the time, they're in the areas around Yosemite south down to the Sequoia National Forest. This species is dependent on old forest characteristics like large trees, conifers, black oaks in particular, and one snags that have cavities that are really good den structures for the species. And they need vegetation cover, especially tree cover, to provide habitat connectivity to be able to move from den site to den site and forage. Interestingly, their biggest predators, bobcats and mountain lions. So they need that veg cover in those den sites to escape those predators with the cavities. Okay, so they've also experienced recent widespread habitat loss due to large wildfires, drought, and other stressors. The study, this was led by Gavin Jones. He's another research ecologist or wildlife biologist for the Rocky Mountain Research Station. But when he did this, he did this study fairly recently. It was published this year. I was a co-author on this. And the question that we wanted to ask was, what is the fate of old forest habitat for fisher in the Southern Sierra Nevada considering wildfires under different forest management scenarios? So this is basically the approach taken as a modeling one. We looked at, Gavin took used a simulation model, looking at the time it takes to get to extinction, if any time at all, and looked at the different probabilities of extinction under these three different scenarios. So what's the scenarios? Next slide. Scenario one, business as usual. So this is the scenario where we basically are going to continue doing what we have done in decades in the past, which is assuming fairly low restoration treatment rates. This is from 5, 10 plus years ago or longer, where the restoration treatment rates were approximately about 7 to 10 percentage of the forest ecosystems in the region would be treated per decade. That's what had been accomplished based on our knowledge of how fast treatments are occurring in the landscape. And we're also assuming continued widespread impacts of wildfires, drought, warming climate, and fisher habitat. I think that's not going to change. That was a pretty safe assumption to make. Next slide. Scenario number 2, model scenario, was what we call the restoration scenario. This scenario was where forest restoration treatments increased substantially. And when I say substantially, that means they double or even triple in some cases over the next 50 years. But to be realistic, we knew that they were going to gradually and slowly increase over the next 50 years to get to that higher level of restoration treatment. And we also assume restored forests exhibit fire effects within the historical range, which is mostly they burn at low to moderate once they're restored. There's dozens of studies in the Sierra Nevada and elsewhere in the western US that show this assumption to be true. So I think it was a good assumption to make. And thirdly, all forest restoration approaches are used when we're talking about restoration. So on the national forest, that includes mechanical thinning. Here in the Inyo, for example, we use prescribed fire. We even manage unplanned ignitions, wildfires, for resource benefit when that opportunity arises. So given all these tools, we can maybe achieve that level of restoration. Next slide. And the scenario number 3 is the one that is we call restoration plus recruitment. It's basically the restoration scenario, plus it assumes that if there's an increase in fish or habitat recruitment that's due to the restoration treatments. And the way that goes is that as restoration treatments are implemented, trees, especially the larger structures that fish are dependent upon, conifers and black oaks, they actually have increased growth rates, increased resilience to stressors. And in some cases, you're even recruiting new, smaller structures to become large over time, which is actually supported by a variety of studies in a number of these old forest stands and elsewhere. So that seemed like, based on the science information, a good assumption to make. But what happens in our model scenario? 1, let's look at the business as usual. Basically, extinction is what happens in the business as usual scenario. In this case, there's a 99% probability of extinction by the end of this 21st century for fishery. That's pretty depressing, but that is basically what happens under this model, simple model scenario. Scenario 2, next slide. That's what we have, the restoration scenario. All of a sudden, that probability of extinction goes up from 99 to 20. So now there's only a 20% chance fish is going to go extinct in the Southern Sierra. And our conclusion, the research conclusion of that scenario is that we see persistence of the population in the Southern Sierra, but at significantly lower population size. Currently, you can see the population is maybe about 400 to 500 individuals. So then it drops to about 150, 250 individuals, somewhere in that range. Next slide. And perhaps most encouraging is restoration and recruitment, which, once again, backed by a lot of the science information, if we can increase those restoration treatment rates significantly, the probability of extinction drops to 2%. So in this case, we have persistence of the population, but at a lower population size. So there is hope for fisher if we can get those restoration treatment rates increased, and if we can make some of these assumptions, which a lot of the science information does support. Next slide. And so I think that we do it's clear that these restoration scenarios, next slide, show that with that recruitment, especially, we can have the population persist in the Southern Sierra. And it also suggests, the study suggests that these business as usual, kind of the past treatment rates we've been experiencing in the Southern Sierra, if that continues, it doesn't bode well for the fisher, based on this model approach. But what else we'll say is, here on the Inyo and the Sierra and the Sequoia, we all have what we call revised land management plans that were just released over the past few years. I know this because I worked on them for a long time. And each of these plans do project or provide flexibility for these increased treatment rates. Now all it takes is to overcome some additional hurdles to increase those treatment rates to the level, and in fact, I think we are achieving that in a number of areas of the Southern Sierra to something that's above 10% per decade. Next slide. And this could put us more in that scenario that's the restoration or restoration plus recruitment scenario, where basically the population does persist. And by the way, the simulation results are supported by field data. It's not just a model outcome that we're talking about here. The actual field data of fisher is a recent study that just came out by Hart et al. This year that shows fisher habitat losses greatest in areas that burn at high severity and the high end of moderate severity, but areas that burn at the lower end of the severity spectrum, they actually show fisher habitat is maintained at a fairly high level. So it's very much supporting the assumptions of this model. Next slide. And probably needs to say here, but our results really suggest that forest restoration at sufficient treatment rates are essential to maintain fisher habitat in southern Sierra. And I'll add that fire regime restoration is critical to achieving these increased restoration treatment rates, because under those 3 plans that I just described for those 3 forests, in every one of those, they note that the only way you're going to get those restoration treatment rates is by increasing the pace and scale of fire-based restoration. And part of that is the mechanical piece is helping us get to that. So all of those treatments, really what we like to say is having all the tools in the toolbox is what's going to get us to that point of saving the fisher and other species. Next slide. Okay, moving on from fisher now to the California spotted owl. Next slide. California spotted owl, so a little background, and sorry if I'm giving background some of you know already, but just to put us all on the same page, this species is an old forest habitat specialist in the Sierra Nevada. It's federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act in the bioregion. Next slide. It depends on large, tall trees as critical nesting habitat. And recently, kind of similar to the fisher, we've seen major habitat loss for the species due to large and severe wildfires, drought, insect outbreaks, and all these different coupled mortality agents. Next slide. And what we wanted to ask in this question was essentially, do wildfires impact or affect California spotted owl occupancy and habitat, such as their prey species availability? Looking at, I have it on here 2 studies, but it's really several different studies that looks at fire effects from a reestablished natural fire regime, Yosemite National Park, and fire effects following a large and severe wildfire following the 2014 King Fire in El Dorado National Forest. Next slide. So, of the first of these studies, fire effects to California spotted owl in Yosemite. This is actually work by one person in our audience here, Susan Roberts, who was formerly with the U.S. Geological Survey, Yosemite Field Station. What she did and her colleagues was they surveyed California spotted owl and small mammal prey in Yosemite National Park in 16 burned and 16 unburned sites back about 20 years ago. And they mostly sampled areas that burned a low to moderate severity, because these aren't areas where you have a reestablished natural fire regime. And you can see that map there showing all the areas in the part of Yosemite that they sampled, so you can tell it was not an easy job to get to all those locations, especially with a bunch of traps, right, Susan? Next slide. So what they found in the results was that California spotted owl occupancy and detection rates were similar between the areas that hadn't burned and the areas that burned at low to moderate severity primarily. And they found in terms of the small mammal prey, richness and abundance of small mammals were broadly similar between the burned and unburned areas. Although they found some nuanced differences, like there were more northern flying squirrels in unburned forests and more wood rats and lodgepole chipmunks in burned forests. What I mentioned those species, well, in particular, the flying squirrel is a primary prey of the California spotted owl in forests and in areas that are not typically could be non-forest vegetation and open, say, canopy gaps. The primary prey for spotted owl are wood rats, of which there are several species in the Sierra Nevada. So it was interesting that in those areas, burned unburned, that both for the spotted owl and its prey, you basically saw very similar levels of abundance and overall biomass. Next slide. In her study, they also found that occupancy was best predicted by total tree biomass. That's kind of an indicator where the large big trees are most likely in the stand. And negative association with coarse woody debris, which is associated with the heavy fuels in the stand, which is also quite interesting because sometimes people associate all that coarse woody debris with increased prey and so on, but not the case, actually negative association. And this suggests, her study suggested that the reestablishment of natural fire regimes maintained high quality habitat for spotted owls in Yosemite. And it also protects habitat from large and severe wildfires in the future. So here is really the first study that demonstrated of an old forest habitat specialist, if you reintroduce fire, it actually does quite well. It does just as well as the areas that have for many decades not seen fire for years, which was really a fascinating result when you think about it. And let's see. Yeah, next slide. So let's jump on to the next study related to spotted owl, because that really addressed the question of, okay, if you have a natural fire regime reintroduced back into the system, do spotted owls do fine? Are they supported? And the answer was, from Susan's study, yes. But what happens when you take a large and severe wildfire that burns well outside what we ever saw historically, primarily a high severity? What happens? Well, this is a study led also by Gavin Jones. This is when he was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. What he did was, he and his colleagues, what they did was they surveyed spotted owls in the El Dorado National Forest after a large and severe megafire. This is the 2014 King Fire. And you can see that map there of the King Fire. Those different colors represent different fire severity classes that I described to you earlier: high, moderate, low. The areas that burned at high are in red. Notice how much of that fire is all red in one big patch or several big patches. That fire burned primarily at high severity, and just by luck or misfortune, however you want to look at it, that fire burned right through the middle of their demographic study area where they've been studying owls for 23 plus years. So they had this perfect opportunity to look at what happens to spotted owls that were there, that they knew were there pre-fire. And you can see some of those dots, the light colored dots are areas where they were pre-fire, but they're not now. What happens to them post-fire? Well, they use this kind of in the science lingo, we like to call it before, after control impact type study on spotted owls. And the great thing about their studies, they're able to control for the effects of post-management type of work, such as salvage logging. They're actually able to remove that analytically from their study. Next slide. And I'm only going to show a few because I don't want to bore you with too many data slides, but what they found is these 3 slides kind of tell the story. The top one, the A slide, maybe you can't read it, but basically that y-axis shows extinction probability of spotted owls, and on the x-axis shows the proportion of the site that burned at high severity. As you go to the far end, your greater proportion of areas that burn at high severity, you basically see extinction probability just goes up pretty dramatically as the proportion of the site that burns at high severity goes up. Secondly, the next two graphs, you can see B and C. B shows extinction probability in areas that burn unburned, let's say low to moderate severity in the middle and high severity at the right. And basically it shows the conditions that between pre-burn and post-burn condition. And you can see those bars in the far right really tell the story that areas that pre-fire, the extinction probabilities were maybe about 10, 15%, but all of a sudden they jump up to about 90% post-fire in the areas that burn at high severity. That's very different than the low to moderate, where there's actually kind of drops post-fire, the extinction probability. And the right very figure shows colonization probability. That's the probability owls will come in after the fire. New owls are dispersing in, and basically at areas that burn at high severity, that colonization probability drops about 30% to 0, versus the low to moderate stays the same. Next slide. So we can conclude, based on the study, that in high severity fire, extinction probability goes up, colonization probability drops dramatically. Low severity fire, low to moderate, extinction probability stays low, and colonization is stable. Unburned areas pretty much mirror what we see in the low to severity burned areas. Next slide. So in conclusion, in Gavin's study, what they found was that the probability of California spotted owl site extirpation or local extinction was about 7 times higher in the fire, after the fire, than before the fire, only in the areas that burn at high severity. Next slide. And it indicates that large and severe wildfires are really detrimental to California spotted owls in the Sierra Nevada and to their population persistence. And you can see it, you go back one more slide. You can see it in that slide. That's showing where a lot of the owl detections are, based on a lot of those points, if you can see them. And you'll notice not a lot of those points occur in those areas that are red. They're actually occurring on the edge of the fire, excuse me, or in areas that burn a low to moderate severity. Next slide. Gavin has been very productive, so he produced yet another paper several years after the study as a Forest Service scientist, and also did some modeling and said, well, what happens if we look at not just fire, but warming climate with fire? And this is just one slide. I'll show you it. They used a habitat modeling study that looks at changes throughout the 21st century for spotted owl. And just so your eyes don't completely glaze over all these figures, I'll just summarize and say, there's a change in owl occupancy that if forest restoration treatments are implemented, especially where they don't take the large trees, important habitat structure for spotted owl, what you see is that you get an increase in, and benefit to owl, increase in occupancy over time versus areas where you don't do that restoration treatment. And that's where this study is really showing the benefits of, even in a warming climate with all these changing fire regimes, increased mega fire occurrence, you can still have owls persist in the landscape well into the 21st century. So that's very encouraging. If restoration treatments are kind of similar to the Fisher, are implemented at sufficient pace and scale. And interestingly enough, I just saw, decided I'd add this slide today, is that, you know, Gavin's study from the 2014 King Fire was like within a year, you know, 23 years prior to the fire, and then a couple of years after the fire. But you might ask, well, what about like 3, 4, 5, 20 years after the fire? Maybe the owls come back in. Well, they just published this last year. This is work also out of the University of Wisconsin lab. And what they found was, using acoustic monitoring across the entire Sierra Nevada bioregion for about 35 years, they looked at not just spotted owls, but all owl species. And what they found was that low to moderate severity fire benefited small cavity nesting owl species like flammulated owl, western screech owl, northern pygmy owl, and California spotted owls. The main pattern they saw with spotted owls was that they greatly avoided high severity patches even 20 years post-fire. So that's also really telling. These effects, the landscape effects of fire on wildlife habitat like spotted owl habitat, is long-term. And you can see then that some of the fires that they sampled there on the map, including the Creek Fire, which is just, you know, the nearest fire to us here on the Sierra National Forest. So next slide. Okay. So I feel like we've been talking a long time. Take a breath. I've been bombarding you with a lot of information, so my apologies for that. But it is for a reason. I've been trying to pull these various pieces together. I'm going to try to pull it now and recap what we've learned from all this different, you know, studies and information we know about fire, wildlife, and Sierra Nevada. So next slide. So in summary, fire exclusion, historical logging, and grazing. We know we've had great impacts of these combined stressors on these ecosystems. They've greatly altered Sierra Nevada forest ecosystems for about a century, century and a half. That's been really clear. That's uncontestable. And current forests are too dense, fuel loaded, and lack big trees. They're spatially homogeneous. That's the slide I wanted to tell you. By the way, that slide on the left, historical photo taken of the Sierra National Forest in the very early 20th century. I took the photo because they had it in a very similar location on the right side, just to show you how that repeat area looks like today. Next slide. Now, current forests are at risk of large and severe wildfires, drought, insect outbreaks, and climate warming, and basically all these various factors are conspiring to reduce the resilience and sustainability of our coniferous and other forest ecosystems in the Sierra Nevada. That's our challenge today. And we're seeing a loss of old forest habitat in the Sierra Nevada due to fire exclusion and all these other historical factors. Next slide. But we can address, and we are addressing this issue. And the way to do that is through forest restoration. Forest restoration can address this problem by reestablishing our natural fire regimes. This includes managed unplanned ignitions like managed wildfires, mechanical 13 prescribed fire. All of these are critical pieces to the forest restoration solution. They reduce forest densities and fuels, restore heterogeneity, and promote large trees. There's literally dozens of studies that have shown this to be the case throughout the Sierra Nevada and the Western US. So we know treatments work. Excuse me. Next slide. Now, based on the studies I just showed you more recently, we also know forest restoration enhances bird, small mammal, plant biodiversity, and habitat heterogeneity, which is so critical to provide the diversity of habitats for all our various species in the Sierra Nevada. They also maintain and restore old forest habitat for Fisher and California spotted owl, and it protects the forest habitat from megafires and other stressors. Next slide. But here's the caveat. Forest restoration is only going to be successful at maintaining and enhancing habitat for spotted owl, Fisher, and a few of these old forest species if we do these things: maintain, retain, and promote large trees on the landscape. So those are and based on the historical studies and what we know these wildlife species using, it's particularly the trees that we consider to be large and big. These are trees that are greater than 36 to 40 inches in diameter roughly. Sometimes it's as low as 30, sometimes it's 40 and above. But whatever the range, those trees that are the biggest in the stand and that have survived for 100, 150 plus years, particularly in areas that have never been logged, those trees have to be maintained. Not just not logged, but also maintained by not being attacked by bark beetles or killed in the next large and severe wildfire. Next slide. And the two other things that have to happen in terms of these caveats is, one, we need to get substantial tree density reduction back to the historical range of variation. So when, in the past, and I want to say some of the earlier thinning treatments that we did in Sierra Nevada might have just taken, reduced 50% of the trees in the stand. And that may be fine if that brings us back to that historical range. But typically, we'd actually need to reduce the density of these trees 2 to 7 times. I even showed you that example, it was 8 times. So we need to substantially reduce those trees that are particularly less than 24 inches in diameter. And there needs to be the application of fire in some way, shape, or form of kind of mimicking a low to moderate severity fire regime to reduce the fuels. That could be prescribed burning, that could be piling the fuels and burning them, or that could be through an unplanned ignition like a managed wildfire. Particularly prescribed burning managed wildfires are the best because that reinstitutes this key ecological process, but even pile burning can be very effective at reducing those surface fuel loads, which is so critical to making them effective. We've actually done another study well over a decade ago that looked at 12 wildfires across the entire state of California, especially in the Sierra Nevada, and looked at field treatment or restoration treatment units that then burned in a wildfire to see if they worked. And in every one of those cases, it worked. So we do know those treatments work effectively for wildfire, and even it works for bark beetles and drought. Next slide. And this brings me kind of the end of my presentation, which is to also highlight that we have a local example here, the Eastern Sierra Climate and Community Resilience Project, which is an excellent example of how we can achieve these restoration objectives, not just at scale, but also doing it in ways that meets all those conditions I just mentioned, of promoting the large trees, reducing tree density sufficiently, and reintroducing fire in one way, shape, or form here on the Indian National Forest. And that gives the opportunity to do all these things I've listed here. Restoring fire's key ecological process, promoting a mature old forest habitat and biodiversity, and protecting our community here in Mammoth Lakes and other communities here in Eastern Sierra. Next slide. And we have other projects, restoration projects on the way. It's just the Resilient Mono Basin Project, which is a little bit further north. So we have excellent examples of these. The Whitebark Institute, partnering with the Indian National Forest, has just been an essential partnership to getting this work done and really jump-started at a faster pace than I've seen most of the restoration projects in the Sierra Nevada. And believe me, I've worked on and seen dozens of these projects here in the Nevada region. So many kudos to the Whitebark Institute for that. Next slide. And so just want to thank our many partners. Whitebark, of course, is top of our list here, but also many of our funding partners and other logistical support partners like CAL FIRE, Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and yes, I'm going to run through this real quick. Town of Mammoth Lakes Fire Department, Mono County, National Forest Foundation, Cal Trout, Great Basin Institute, Plumas Corps, Caltrans, and there's really too many more to list. That was my short list, by the way. There's many more. And next slide, this I think is my last one. Oh no, and I want to acknowledge the primary authors of those studies I mentioned to you earlier. So we got Zach Steele and Gavin Jones now with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station did fantastic work on looking at fisher and biodiversity patterns with fire. Susan Roberts, who's here tonight, formerly with the USGS Yosemite Field Station, looking at spotted owl in Yosemite and fire effects there. And I got to, of course, mention the Indian National Forest, who I work for. The INYO staff are absolutely critical to all this work as well. So many thanks to them. And next slide, I think this is it. Yes. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, probably went a little long, but thank you for your attention. Hopefully this was informative for you. And I'm assuming there's time for questions, and there's probably some sort of quiz at the end.